and safety moment and equity moment, and go from there. So just going to give it another 2 minutes as folks probably transition from whatever they had going on the early part of their day to this meeting. Cool. I see Megan, I see D'Amico, Monica. Hi, welcome, folks. Yes. So cool. Okay. We'll give it 1 more minute and then we'll jump in as I can see that we've got several members from the advisory group here. And so again, just like another minute and then we'll start rolling on it. Okay. We can go ahead and get started. Um, Hi everyone. Welcome back. Um, we're here again for another episode and round of the Equity Advisory Group meeting. Before folks joined, Ariam and Troy were talking about Star Trek, so then I was now thinking about like some sort of TV intro, but I bailed on it real quick. So, um, this is another meeting of the Equity Advisory Group. Um, thanks for folks for being here. Um, as we get started, just wanted to acknowledge who I am and who we are, and welcome folks into the space. Ishmael Nunez with Uncommon Bridges. We are serving as the facilitation team, sorry, for the Equity Advisory Group. We're happy to be here again. Um, we wanted to acknowledge a couple of sort of moments and some of our acknowledgments, and then we'll jump into our agenda at that point in time and what we've got set up and planned for today's meeting. And so we'll start with a safety moment, then we'll have which I think Yvonne will do. Um, we'll have an equity moment from Amasai from the advisory group, and then an equity forum update from members of the Equity Forum Planning Committee to give us a little bit of an update on our most recent equity forum that happened in Bremerton. So we'll start there, and then I'll actually acknowledge a couple of holidays and things that folks can look forward to celebrating or just recognizing or what has just passed. And go from there. So, with that being said, I would love if I think this is going to be Yvonne. Oh, I see Lisa. I see Lisa's name on the call. Lisa or Yvonne. I know Lisa, you were having trouble joining, so not to put you on the spot, but um, if one of y'all want to kick us off with a safety moment, please do.
Yeah, I can go ahead. I think Lisa is having a little bit of tech issues right now. So welcome everyone. So for today's safety moment, and actually for future safety moments too, in the EAG meetings, we're shifting this a little bit to provide a safety moment that's related to utilities, and so that it gives you more you're more informed, and it's also more of an educational moment as well for all of you. So as we enter the fall and winter, want to acknowledge that we'll have probably storms in the near future, and so when we go and when we look at and we encounter downed lines, just be aware and some tips to avoid, assuming that if you see a down line, they are energized. So don't go near them. Stay at least 35 feet away and call 911 to report it. So, and if you are in a vehicle and you're struck by a down power line, just stay inside your vehicle and call 911. So those are some of the tips when you do see a down power line.
Thank you, Yvonne, and thanks for the acknowledgement of some of these safety moments being a little bit more tied to the utility and being more tied to the utility and what we need to know. Appreciate Jenny in the chat. We can do that in a moment, but appreciate. No, you're good. Appreciate that. Some recognition to us as a team, which we can do a little update in a second here. But I'd love to those stories of home or those stories of migration. And you something that where you said that resonated really strong with me is we go back home a lot and we go back home to less and less. And so there's a piece there that is a recognition of folks like you and the work that you all are doing and who you're serving. And that's true in a lot of some other cases as well. And then the other side of that is sort of this reality that Christopher and Amy talked about with folks, particularly Indigenous folks here, and how some of those same, or not same, but sort of similar climate impacts are impacting folks that are here, particularly native peoples to these lands. And so there's this, like, I'd like to, Amy, how you pointed out sort of the centering of the like human and this notion of climate refugee of folks who are displaced. And also there is the yeah, it's sort of the acknowledgement of what its impact is having on our lands, on the world, but also sort of local here, the sort of global to local. So yeah, thank you, Amasai, for sharing that. And I have your video open, but I'll watch it when we get through with the video or with the meeting. So um okay. Yeah, appreciate that. Okay. So last of our acknowledgments before we roll into the rest of the meeting and sort of getting into some of the discussion, especially we wanted to make some space for a brief report out from members of the Equity Forum Planning Committee. One thing I'll acknowledge before those members share out a little bit on the most recent Bremerton Equity Forum is, and we're going to talk about this more in today's meeting, in fact, but members of the EAG that sit on this subcommittee, which has to do with the planning of these equity forums, are really motivated not only in just the planning part and the participation and facilitation of the events, but also in the way in which it adds value to the EAG as a whole. So for today, there is sort of a relatively brief, we can call it reporting out from members, but we are in ongoing dialogue around how to sort of more comprehensively integrate the learnings of any equity forum, certainly this Bremerton one, and there's the next that we've got coming up into this group's work. So we'll make some space here or offer some space here. I know we have D'Amico and Dennis and Amy. I'm not sure who will kick us off. It might be you, D'Amico. I saw you come on camera when the slide came up. Jenny, thank you. Yeah. So I'll turn it over to whomever would like to share a little bit about the Bremerton Equity Forum and what we'd like folks to know.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I know that Amy initially was going to come in later. I'll take the lead. Yeah, for the equity forum that we had there in Bremerton on the 21st of September was very engaging, very insightful as well. Just really just looking through the lens of the community, their needs and their challenges, are.
And folks participating in the planning committee. One thing, so a couple of themes just that come out, and again, producing a summary which will get distributed to this group. But yeah, sort of this consistent contact as Jenny was talking about, where I don't think it's necessarily an expectation from folks, for example, that attended the Bremerton Forum that something like that would happen again and again and again, but being able to know that that was a door that people could come into access PSC and that there would be other ways to continue is important. I'm picking up actually on something, you know, Monica used the term in your chat, dug into the most effective outreach methods. And I think that was also one of the values of this forum. To Dennis's point, he said it well when we were there, he's like, I think this was a manageable group or a size, an appropriate size, because you did get to dig in. And I felt like that was an important piece. And then the last piece, which we'll talk about later in this meeting, is D'Amico's sort of call to action around having participation from the EAG. We're going to talk about that a little bit more today as it relates to some of the proposed sort of restructuring of the group's sort of leadership and accountability, and where some of that takes place and shows up. The subcommittees, particularly this one, is one of those for sure, which includes, as I mentioned earlier, the ways in which it integrates back into this group. So yeah, thanks folks for that. I see in the chat some folks acknowledging that it's a fantastic update. Great job, D'Amico, Jenny. TikTok would be cool. Chris saying great job over in Bremerton. A lot of funds going in. There need to be a conversation for the community in the region, military, non-military families. PSC as an equity partner with continuous conversation will prove well for future outreach. So awesome. So I'm going to move us along here today, but I think we'll come back to this actually relatively shortly in some for another. So getting into some of the meat of at least our agenda, but a reminder that we are hosting this meeting. We are live streaming this meeting. Observers on the live stream, please respect the Equity Advisory Group's time to meet and discuss topics. We'll talk halfway in the meeting during a break around how folks that are viewing as members of the public could join the meeting during public comment period. Otherwise, our group here, yeah, really encourage active participation. And again, I say this often. I totally get it's evening. If you got things going on in the background and you're going to be stepping away from a computer, or you know that you're not in a great spot to sort of be on camera or anything like that, totally understand that. And if you are not in that position and you are able and willing to be and sort of present active member, we really appreciate that. Seeing you on camera, reading body language is very helpful for us as the facilitation team as well, and making sure that we feel like we're all present and participating in this thing together. I talked about the public comment period and live stream. And so our agenda, and actually just before diving into the agenda, another acknowledgement I wanted to make. Couple of sort of cultural celebrations and holidays or moments to sort of pay respects. We celebrated, at least on our side, the Indigenous Peoples Day yesterday, and I know that several organizations and several entities are leaning into sort of that reframe, which feels very, very important. And obviously we had a moment of acknowledgement of some of the impacts, especially on Indigenous peoples from on the side, this start of this call. Diwali is this month, the end of October, for folks who are Sikh. I grew up in a community that actually was Sikh, and so Diwali was a big deal. And sure, my dad is going to go to all this stuff back home. And I know that Yom Kippur was over this past weekend, so a couple of acknowledgements of some of those celebrations. For our meeting today, we actually wanted to emphasize some sort of emerging topics, emerging conversations that felt like they needed to have space and time in today's meeting. The first being conversation and acknowledgement that's been largely offline with members of this group, but feeling to bring the whole group around CETA target, the clean energy target reduction requests for 2024 and 2025. Kara will talk a little bit about what what the background and details are, an acknowledgement that there has been some offline discussion and members of the EAG felt it was important for everyone to be able to hear that conversation and hear what some of those impacts may be. And then likewise, a conversation that also started in our steering committee about or the steering committee for the Equity Advisor Group that talks a little bit about roles, leadership, accountability, how the group where are the spaces and opportunities to shift some of the autonomy and planning and influence to EAG members as it relates to y'all's experience, and making sure that everybody has a chance to hear that and feel comfortable with that before moving forward with that being sort of a structure. After a break, we'll talk about the work that PSE is doing and beginning a distributional equity analysis on net metering. We'll hear from Michael here, who will talk a little bit about what the net metering program is and what a distributional equity analysis is. And we'll have some time there for group discussions and breakouts. We'll close with next steps and leave some space for public comment. So our first piece here is just some acknowledgements and some of these emerging topics that I actually felt they needed to have space and time in this meeting that we were trying to fit in where they might fit best. And it felt like making some adjustments to the planning to make sure that we could do that today was our goal. So with that being said, I will, that's what I just said. I will turn it over to Kara here to talk a little bit about sort of the background context of this being sort of an emergent topic, an issue that is relevant to EAG members.
Great. Thank you, Ishmael. Nice to see everyone tonight. Thank you for really making some space for this conversation, as Ishmael alluded to, related to a filing we made last month on our CEIP targets. You know, it's great to have a chance to talk to you more about this, especially just given the EAG's really important role in shaping our first CEIP and really being a part of that ground level conversation around these targets. So really appreciate being able to share with a little bit more with you than beyond the email update that I sent as we were making this filing. And Amy, I really do appreciate you voicing your thoughts and concerns with PSC and the EAG offline, and do want to echo that we welcome having this dialogue with you all on this issue. If you could go to the next slide, please. So before I talk about the filing we made specific to the targets, I just wanted to cover a little bit of background. It's, you know, a refresher for members who have been with the EAG for a while, perhaps new information for a few of you. So we established the EAG in the spring of 2021, right about the time we were beginning to develop in earnest our first Clean Energy Implementation Plan, or CEIP. And we really were doing that beginning in the heart of COVID, as we were developing kind of our projections for what load might look like over that 4-year period. And you'll see in the chart on the right-hand side, these were the annual targets that we forecasted achieving in 22, 23, 24, and 25 in that first plan. And we did that making a number of assumptions in writing our first plan. Again, we were assuming a certain level of load forecasted that we developed during what we kind of thought was going to happen as we were in the thick of COVID. We assumed a certain level of generation from each of our renewable resources. Consistent with the Commission's rules, we were assuming that this really was informed by median or average hydro conditions over a period of time. And as I'll talk a bit more, what we've actually experienced over the last couple of years has been significantly lower than average hydro conditions, really because really driven by the weather that has really affected our performance towards our target. And another thing, you know, key assumption we made when we filed our 2021 plan is that, you know, we were looking at our resource acquisition process, our process for considering new renewable resources that might be available to come online within the CEIP period. And we were looking at those, and at the time we wrote the plan, we anticipated that many of these projects could be online by the end of 2025, if not a bit earlier than that. And so all of those things kind of factored into the targets that we ultimately established and the progress we were thinking we could achieve over this 4-year period. If you go to the next slide, please, I'll just talk a little bit about what's changed since we filed the original plan. You might hear PSC sometimes talk about load growth. That's really where we see the demand on our system growing at a faster pace than our very sophisticated math tells us the pace that we should anticipate. And so that is largely, we try to do our best to forecast what we think loads will be, but in the case of doing that demand forecast in COVID and then finding that, I mean, we really were in an unprecedented time, right? So we didn't even really know what customer usage patterns were going to look like or shift as they have. And so what we found is that for say, let's take the year 2024 as an example. Our actual load in 2024 was 9% higher than what we thought it was going to be when we wrote the plan. And when it's a percentage target, as we set it out, that really makes a difference, because the planning, the requirement doesn't say we want you to meet the percentage as you expected it to be. It says, well, it's a percentage delivered to loads, so delivered to customers. And so if your load is higher, well, you need more megawatt hours, you need more clean resources to achieve that same percentage. So that was one factor that has created some challenges for us. And then I mentioned this earlier, but our hydro generation has really performed well below the average that we assumed in our 2021 CEIP. About 22% lower in 2023. And even we're seeing it roughly a 34% lower for the first several months of this year in 2024. Our other renewable resources, wind, solar, and biomass, have also performed below our expectations, not as dramatically so, but again, that still kind of makes a difference in the percentage we're actually able to achieve. And of course, competition has grown since we filed the plan, and I'm sure you've all read articles about potential growth and demand due to AI, or articles about competition for renewables in the region. That's been not only making things more challenging, but increasing the price of renewables. And that means ultimately the price also that we would be passing along to customers. And then the final thing that kind of is just making progress move a little more slowly than we had hoped is that many of the new resources that we were considering in our process, our acquisition process, have proven to be on a slower timeline than they originally anticipated. So when we drafted the plan, we thought that many of these resources would be online in that first 4-year period. Those same projects, though, have actually extended their timelines out to 27, 28, or have found that they don't quite have the transmission access perhaps that they thought. And so all of those things have just created some challenges for us, at least in the near term. Next slide, please. So why did we propose to update our targets? Really, for us, we remain committed to meeting our long-term 2030 and beyond clean energy objectives. This is really, in our view, this is about asking the question of the Commission of how much is reasonable to spend in the short term for short-term clean energy resources. And I'll give you an example. So because we haven't been able to have very many new long-term resources available within this short-term, near-term window, that means our alternative to fill the gap is to look for short-term resources. And so as an example, we've had opportunities to purchase, say, the output from a hydropower facility operated by a public utility district in Eastern Washington. They generate a certain amount of renewable power. They may not need to keep it all for their own CETA needs. And so they sell us the output, not just at their cost, but with a premium is often what we find ourselves encountering. And so from our standpoint, all of those challenges that I mentioned earlier were things that we started to daylight with the Commission when we filed our biennial update back in November of last year. We were seeing the low growth, we were seeing project timelines extend, we were seeing our generation not at the level we had expected. So we foreshadowed these things, and you might recall we asked the Commission if we could lower our 63% target to 60%. And we said, oh, and can we calculate, we think it would be better to calculate the targets over a 4-year period and as an average. And the reason why we proposed that change is that should give you an ability to smooth out some of that variability. So perhaps you have a poor hydro year. Well, then hopefully eventually the weather breaks in our favor at some point, right? And you have a better than average hydro year, and you could balance out some of those variations. The Commission decided at that time that they they didn't want to modify our existing targets. They said no to the averaging approach for now, but left the door open to us proposing it in a future CEIP. And then they gave us some guidance that we weren't quite sure what to do with, which was they said it's not okay for you to pursue the targets at any cost, because they clearly, and we share this concern, have a concern about affordability for customers. They said, well, if it's going to be unreasonably costly for you to meet your targets, we'll consider that at the end of the 4-year period when we determine whether you complied or not. And from our standpoint, that makes it hard for us as a utility to know where to draw a line on reasonably costly. At this point, with the challenges we've faced, we're sort of sitting at a point where our current achievement for this year is looking to be somewhere in that 48 to 50% range. We could do our best to fill the remainder with short-term resources, but that's an additional cost to customers that doesn't provide that longer term benefit. It's not new steel in the ground for a new wind facility. It's us, say, buying some extra output from another utility that to us doesn't really move the ball on addressing climate change. It means we pay more for a resource that already exists. And from our standpoint, if the commission wants us to spend the $200 million premium, we're willing to do that, but we're really looking for some direction from them on whether they think that's reasonable or not to do. As we put it in our filing, we don't think that's a reasonable cost at that level to pass on to customers, really to be buying those clean energy attributes. And we think we should be focused more on the longer term in terms of meeting the 2030 targets. And we're really looking to get a signal from the commission on which way they would like us to go on that issue. That might be my last slide. I might have another one. Let's see. Do you mind advancing? Okay, that was my last slide. So I'll just pause and see. Happy to take questions and have some more conversation around this.
Yeah, thanks, Kara. And I'll just acknowledge as we do that. So yeah, the goal, I mean, Kara, you closed off with PSE is sort of in a position right now where waiting to get some guidance and have voiced this, for lack of a better word, sort of argument to the commission and seeing where they would all like. And so yeah, so this is PSE communicated this, or Kara communicated this to the EAG in an email, and it prompted some questions and some reactions. And we're sitting in some of these, reasonably costly versus affordability, this long-term planning versus short-term targets. And so there are real tensions here that I know folks have a lot of interest to help sort of shape that conversation and that understanding. So I can at least see Monica in the chat, and so I'll start there, and then if folks have anything that they want to jump in and add to, please do. Yeah, and I see Amy's hand. Great. So and maybe I'll read this in the chat, and Monica, if you have anything you want to add, please do, and then we can go to Amy. But Monica said overall concern is missing the overall long-term goals. The development of new clean resources is unlikely to be faster. Demand is likely to continue increasing. Question about, are there more or larger projects in the works given these updated variables? Monica, do you have anything you want to add to that or speak to?
No.
Great. Well, I'm happy to respond to that, Monica, and thanks for asking the question. We are, as I mentioned earlier, we see a pathway to, or I may not have said it quite this way. We not only remain committed to achieving our 2030 targets, but we see a pathway to getting there. I think you're right to acknowledge that demand may continue to increase. The development of new resources may continue to be, or developing them at speed may continue to be a challenge. But with things that we currently have in the pipeline and under consideration, we see a pathway right now to getting to approximately 70% in the 2030 to 2033 timeframe, that CETA compliance period. And we have a current new active request for proposals, it's called, or a new acquisition process that shows to us that there's the potential to get that remaining bit to 80%. We're still going to keep our eye on all of those challenges because I don't want to suggest that they're going to go away. We're going to need to continue to account for that risk that we continue to see lower than average hydro, that demand keeps growing. And so those are things that we're looking at in our our integrated system plan approach is how do we really plan even better to accommodate and plan for that risk. But as I said, I mean, we are still very committed to those long-term CETA goals, and we see a pathway to getting there. I'm not going to say that it's going to be easy, but we're cautiously optimistic that we have resources in the pipeline, and we're really committed to finding a way to get there.
Great. Thanks.
The one that deals with them directly, I'm trying to think of what perspective I have to offer on that question. I think what I would say is that at least my understanding of the public utility districts and kind of how they are situated is that when CETA passed, many of them were in a position where between their access to Bonneville Power, BPA Power as preferential customers, and I can explain that more in a minute if you're interested, but they have access to low-cost federal hydropower through their longstanding relationship with Bonneville. That, coupled with the hydroelectric facilities that they own and operate, puts them in just a very different place than PSE is at. Many of them were at 70% or more renewable when CETA was passed. And so for them, they don't have a hill to climb to get to 80%. If anything, some of them are already there, and they can make choices about, okay, well, for now, perhaps PUDA doesn't need to hold on to all 80%. They can sell certain slices that they don't need to serve their customers to help utilities like Puget meet their own clean energy goals. And so we are seeing as I mentioned before, we are seeing a premium because there's competition for those hydro resources. We're not the only utility looking to secure more clean resources to serve our load. And so I think it is an opportunity for them. I can't really speak to how much of a financial opportunity it is for them, but I'm sure that it does help with their operational needs. And for them, they need to propose targets just like we do to make progress. But under the law, the first main milestone for CETA compliance is that carbon neutrality starting in 2030. And so some of them have the opportunity to, hold on to it or be able to sell a portion of it. And we've been able to benefit from that arrangement.
And no, if there's another question in the chat, they can go ahead.
I believe Dennis had a question in the chat. How has there been discussion to dedicate 200 million or a portion to future capital expansion of sustainable capacity?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dennis. Not that I'm aware of just yet. With this 200 million, and really, I want to be clear, it's just an estimate, right? We developed an overall estimate of what we thought it might take, given the market conditions we're seeing, to fill that gap. And specifically, if we're only able to get so much, say, from resources in Washington, then we were thinking about also the California market, which is higher cost for renewables and what it might take to get there. But it's very much an estimate at best. But in considering that, we were thinking those are not costs that we currently have built into our customer rates, and they're not what we have even in our current general rate case that is before the commission that I'm not here to talk about. But I will say that estimate's not included in what we have in the case, and so we're calling the question on the 200 million, but it's not as if it's a 200 million in our current budget, if that makes sense. And so I think your point is well taken. And I think from our standpoint, we are at least aligned in that direction and thinking, gosh, a 200 million, that's not 200 million total power costs. That's 200 million for the clean energy premium. There are other ways we can reach our clean energy and sustainability goals in a more long-term way that might be a better way to spend those funds. And that's the question that we have before the commission that we're looking for some direction on. I hope that helps. We all some coordination and in terms of we all worked on the initial, we all participated with the commission on the initial set of rules regarding CETA. There continue to be policy issues that we work through together and provide comments on. we participate in conversations around like a regional market that could support clean energy goals. So there are lots of ways that the three utilities work together. I just didn't want to suggest that from a CETA perspective, there's not really we don't see a lot of opportunities to directly work together. But that's not, I guess I would also say though, there are sometimes opportunities where Vista might have excess hydropower that they would make available that we could purchase from them. So it's not like there aren't some of those opportunities, but the conversation with the commission has been fairly, on the plans themselves, has been fairly independent with each utility, not as kind of a joint effort. It was more joint when we were developing the rules and kind of understanding the law and the rules, and now it tends to be a little bit more utility by utility. But they are competing for the same sort of renewable resources, right, in the state, as we all try to meet our goals. So there is that as well.
Yeah, no, it's what Amy is saying sounds idealistic, and I don't say that with any sense of like naivety about the topic. It is something that would be great to be able to see that, and thanks, Kara, for that, and Amy for those questions. Okay, I want to make sure we get to a couple folks before we sort of wrap on questions here. So I see Monica, you have your hand, and then I saw some comments in the chat.
Yep. So I'm not sure who.
There are a number of new projects that we have made investments in since CETA was passed, and I think, I don't know if I actually attached the correct document to the email that I sent out. So if I didn't, I'm happy to send that around again. But we've made a number of investments since 2019. Beaver Creek is one of the most recent ones, with a wind facility that's to be online near the end of 2025. So we are really keenly interested in making those investments in long-term resources, and this current RFP is larger than one we've ever had in history, and we're seeking specifically clean energy out of this. So I think we're finding actual conditions to be harder than we thought when we wrote the plan in 2021, and that's and so we're trying to be transparent about those while also really pursuing a bit of an all of the above approach, like, again, revisiting all the tools in our toolkit in terms of conservation is a key part of the equation, right? There can be distributed resources as part of the portfolio, and these utility scale resources. We're just finding that a lot of them that we hoped would be online in 24, 25 are still needing transmission or still running into permitting and siting challenges. And so their timeline is closer to the end of the decade than where we were hoping they were going to be in 25. And so those challenges are there, but I think you're asking the right question in terms of those long-term resources. And that's where we see the long-term value to customers, the ability to move the needle on climate change, is like when we're adding, new clean resources to the region and putting those in our portfolio longer term. Those short term still matter, and we'll still continue to try to do those. But at a certain point, it's like, well, to what extent and at what cost does that make sense to do?
Cool. Thank you. Okay.
I think that's going to be a really important part of the conversation as we develop this new integrated system plan that we'll file. We'll file it the very first day of 2027, but essentially it'll be a plan that we're working on a lot next year and into 2026. Is really, what is that? What do we think that trajectory potentially looks like over the next several years? Both kind of, what does PSC have in their existing portfolio? What have we lined up that isn't coming online till 27 or 28, and how does that contribute? And then what do we think is going to come in terms of new resources that we're actively starting to evaluate now? We're hoping this current RFP process is going to wrap up in about a year. Our last one lasted almost 3. So we're hoping to do our due diligence, but also be able to move more quickly in making decisions and hopefully securing the resources that we need.
Great. Okay. I see a couple of other comments, and so I want to make sure we get to folks before we wrap. And yes, there's acknowledged in the chat. Yeah, I use the term idealistic. I did not mean, I'm like still thinking about the right word. The better word I meant to say for that, for to take your comment, Amy, didn't mean that in a way that your comments are naive, but that it was sort of, there was a strong proposal there that I think is a scenario that we should be striving toward. Okay, there's a point in the chat here that said, is there an option for PSE to consider the slowdown or to slow down the increase of demand of electricity by promoting energy conservation, given that the generation of clean energy is estimated to be lower than expected, and would these updates be shared with customers?
Yeah, that's a great point, Karya. Energy efficiency is really the cornerstone that we sort of build up from in terms of pursuing all cost-effective conservation that we can get our hands on. And then with the passage of the new House Bill 1589, there's also, we have to look at particular levels of energy efficiency achievement. And so I think the short answer is yes, we are going to be re-looking at that, looking at sort of what might be cost effective and is also achievable. We need our customers to participate. We can provide incentives, but they have to also take action in order for that conservation to work. And so we're always looking at ways that we can maximize that energy efficiency piece because it really helps. And it is such a low cost resource that we have to start with. Great question.
Great. Okay. So we'll take a couple more comments and then we'll start to wrap this. But I appreciate everyone with all the questions and like we mentioned at the start, it's important that we're able to have a dialogue and not have it be too static. I think I saw C's hand.
A couple of things. The first key sort of universal milestone that all utilities need to achieve is hitting that carbon neutral, that 80% renewable or non-emitting over the 2030 to 2033 time period. So that applies whether you're a public utility district or you're one of the three regulated utilities by the commission. We also have to propose under the law, and so do the public utilities, interim targets that demonstrate we are making progress towards that 80% carbon neutral standard. It's up to each utility to kind of propose what they think is reasonable progress given where they started from. For us, we started, we look at sort of where we were in 2020 and then how do we make progress so that ideally we make progress and we also avoid rate shock for customers and we can smooth out that cost trajectory and investments over the rest of this decade. And so we all have to propose interim targets, and then the commission expects us to demonstrate at the end of the 4-year period if we've met them, and if we haven't, why not? And so for us, given we're in a place where we foresee that if low hydro conditions continue and load stays at the level that we're seeing, we feel like we're not positioned to meet the targets we originally set out. Even with making quite a few short-term purchases along the way. And so we would rather sort of be transparent about where, thank you. See, I did touch on this a little bit earlier. I will try to be more succinct. No, I just wanted to note that this did come up a little bit earlier before you joined, but it's worth reiterating. We understand that concern, right? And we want to be transparent about the challenges we're seeing, but at the same time, we really want to get there and we see a pathway. And so we see with our existing pipeline, we think we have a line of sight to about 70% in that 2030 to 2033 timeframe, right? And then we have our existing RFP, which has, there'll be more, but we see potential there to be able to sort of bridge the gap to 80% by there. It'll be a lot of investment in new resources, but we still think it's possible, and we still think that that's
just an acknowledgement of some of the pieces here. Yeah.
Yeah. See, I appreciate your comments, and I think that I agree partially with your sense that utilities have been doing this for a long time. But CETA and planning targets this is our first plan, and this is still new, and we're still figuring out the rules of the road with the commission of what they even expect, and do they want us to spend money on short-term resources that don't contribute to the long-term or not? And these are just the kind of, some of this to me is some of the growing pains of a new law and new implementation, and what does this all mean, and what is the expectation on the utility as we sort out what those expectations are. And so that I would just offer that I think that this is still new ground for us, but I absolutely agree that this is a risk that we have to be planning even better for in the future, in our future looking, and it's something that we're discussing a lot as our teams are and how we think and do that. So, okay, not very brief. I'll
Yeah,
stop.
no, you're good. You're good. I wanted to make sure that folks' questions got answered and there was opportunity for dialogue. So I want to acknowledge a couple of things, and then if folks are willing to sort of move on here for the sake of today, the first will be just sort of a summation of some of the themes, and I think like you made a good point, and you said, you know, we wouldn't be doing our job or as the equity advisory group, and I think that's 100% right. And I think something that we really want to acknowledge, and I wanted to acknowledge what Kara just said of this actually is relatively new or new ground, and particularly if we think about the motivations driving some of the decision making and sort of historical sort of targets and sort of bottom lines of like investor owned utilities, we now have this really important and really meaningful I mean, it's a requirement, but it's a really meaningful assertion around clean energy and sort of this transition. And so, in some ways, and I'm not saying this specifically about PSC, but in some ways, this is something that has not been planned for. And so, you're completely right when you name all of those different risks, and you completely right, Monica, as well, when you're like, you know, I'm not sort of sure. And I think that that's just true. I think that's part of the reality is we're not so sure. The thing that I think is important that I say, you know, I will echo and underscore that, you know, you as an EAG are doing your job well, is highlighting some of these major areas that require some of these really, I'm going to go up to Monica's early phrase here, sort of digging in, you know, this balance around sort of affordability and what, you know, there was the phrase, Kara, in your piece there around sort of reasonable cost. Like, what does reasonable cost actually mean, and to who bears that, and when is it something that is not, that doesn't hold true anymore? That feels like a reasonable, or that feels like a fair topic theme for this group to be grappling with, this piece around sort of long-term planning and knowing that we have this long-term target, but not being um uh you know, not overlooking what's needed to do to get into that piece. So this affordability, this long-term planning, this constant awareness and landscape of changing variables and where other points of risk are, not just in sort of demand and usage, but I think as the EAG thinking holistically in a lot of the topics that we talk about as it relates to sort of context, cultural context. You know, we talked at the beginning of this meeting about influx of people or sort of migration related to climate change and impacts. And so those are part of this sort of whole conversation of these variables that maybe even right now we're not entirely understanding or accounting for. And then Amy had talked a lot in here about sort of collaborations and partnerships. And I think that that's also a really relevant place for this EAG to sort of sit in. So I think there are some really important themes that have come out of this back and forth um, um, that I just want to acknowledge. And I think that the goal of what we are trying to do here as a collaboration, the EAG, PSC, is to be able to sit down and have some of these dialogues. So I wanted to just say that. I want to acknowledge a couple of the chat messages that we didn't get to. And then, as usual, I just want to give them, I just want to read them aloud and then acknowledge if there's pieces that we still would like some follow up. And you know, Kara, thank you for being here, and I'm sure that you're open to having ongoing dialogue as we move forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So some of these chat messages I'll just acknowledge here. And Ariam acknowledged that all questions are being captured in the meeting summary notes. There's a question from Dennis: are there fundamental assumptions in the energy consumption and generation that are permanently changing the plan to meet PSC's final goals? It's a good question. Amy said, just to say, I think the region needs more strategic planning, not just profits driven, but for the wellness of all, whether or not it's a public utility district or an investor-owned utility. And I think that's a great point. And again, I think that's something that the EAG is sitting in to be able to have those discussions is highly relevant. Monica said, agree with C. We would be doing a disservice to our role as EAG members if we didn't express the concern about the progress and request more details about how we get to the long-term clean energy goals. Now is the time to perhaps overinvest. What's the worst that could happen? We hit 100% clean energy. And C said, what are the consequences of PSC? It doesn't meet its 2030 80% reduction goals. So I just wanted to acknowledge those. I'm going to move us here in time, but just make note of those as Ariam said, and continue to make sure that we have the sort of top emergent conversations in this group as we need to. Marco, so what is the process in place for the EAG to share our position? Yeah, and I think that's also a good question. And I want to actually get to that. I'm going to use that as a segue to this next piece, but I'm acknowledging where we are on time. We were planning to do a break a little bit earlier. Do folks want to do break or just thread this into this next discussion piece? Maybe we can do a 5. Let's do a quick 5, 6:28, and we'll flow into this next piece. Okay, see folks back in 5 minutes. Okay. Folks are nearby, can hear my voice. We'll jump back in if you're wrapping up your break. That is okay. If you're here and let me know you're here either with having your camera on. Thanks, folks, or thumbs up. Okay, awesome. Okay, so we wanted to just acknowledge and I just want to sort of frame up as we go into this next piece that this is actually we just sort of experienced or had a practice of a shift that we want to talk about here in this meeting, and sort of like as a proposal to the whole group. And what we just sort of experienced all together is actually a seeing of that shift in action. And so essentially as we've come on as the facilitators of this group, we've acknowledged and we've said this a lot to folks that there's existing rhythms and patterns, routine in how the equity advisory group and its development, its planning and preparation has come about. And we've observed where that, and we've talked to a lot of members of the EAG. We've observed where that it works really well and where are the places that it might be a little bit of a hindrance to the EAG's full participation. And so something that we acknowledge is that there are many spaces where EAG members are in actually a position of leadership as it relates to driving on conversation. They happen in the steering committee meetings. They happen in the equity planning forum committee meetings. Obviously here is a place that we're all together. A lot of times we're being responsive to, PSC topics. And I think the thing that we have acknowledged is that we need to be able to be a little bit more proactive. And I say we from the PSC side, the facilitation side, in creating really clear expectations of where are the spaces that there isn't a lot of flexibility, where is there a UTC requirement and a deadline that needs very certain attention, and then where are the spaces that we can actually elevate some of the EAG member priorities and EAG member themes. And so this meeting, we were going to have some other topics presented, and we pivoted. We shifted with feedback from members, particularly on the steering committee, around this conversation of the clean energy targets was one of those items that felt like it needed this level of space and dialogue and back and forth. And so we wanted to give it that. We wanted to couch that in this conversation of the way in which we're making these shifts. And similarly, members of the steering committee said, bring that conversation to this full group. And so this is where we want to go here next. And so I want to sort of frame that this is all part of a sort of proposal from us as the facilitation side around how to hopefully make meetings feel more or make members feel like they are really involved in the planning and determination of what's happening on this group, its conversations, its priority topics, its positioning. And so I wanted to just take a brief moment. It'll be very brief to share how we proposed some of that restructuring. And I know that something that members in the steering committee acknowledge is like, we want the whole group to be on board with that. We're not here to sort of steamroll these proposals. And so this is us showing that to you, to everyone here on this meeting. So the thing that we've acknowledged and we've seen is that there are beyond the EAG full meetings, monthly meetings, there are a couple of opportunities that feel really primed for EAG members to lead on these broader goals of the group and its planning. The steering committee is a great space for members that participate in that group to drive on EAG agenda development. The current cadence of meetings has meant that SteerCo meets very close to the monthly EAG meeting. It doesn't leave like literally enough days at times to really have an influence on what's going to happen in a meeting. And so what we want to be able to do and talk about is what does it actually look like for the steering committee to be a space that's driving on EAG agendas, balancing whatever things are top priority topics from PSC or the commission with themes, topics, conversations, news that the EAG prioritizes. So I'll talk about that in a second. But the steering committee feels like that is the purpose of that space. The Equity Forum Planning Committee, we talked about not just the planning, not just the attending the sessions, but also the debriefing and then the EAG integration. We gave some space at the top of this meeting to do a little bit of a share out, but that group has a lot of goals around how they want that work and those efforts to filter into this process, and wanting to make sure again, where is the space for that to happen, and who is helping to sort of dictate what the EAG's full visibility is on some of these items. And then TBD, those are the primary subcommittees, and perhaps in the history of this committee, there's been more. There could be another, but the goal basically being here that these are all purpose-driven spaces that EAG members are leading in helping the planning done by the facilitation team and PSC staff around where full EAG members are participating. To do so, for that to be a shift that we acknowledge and say, yeah, that sounds good, let's do that, we actually need some commitments from the group as a whole. We need to authorize the subcommittees as the driver. The EAG needs to provide their motivation, their consent, their consensus that if somebody sits in a subcommittee meeting and someone else does not, or if you say, I'm not going to participate in the subcommittee for whatever reason, I am acknowledging that the upcoming agenda is influenced largely by my peers. So we want to authorize that subcommittees are places where we can drive on some of this production. That we need to shift a cadence of meetings, and some of that has to do with sort of that flow we talked about on how PSC was doing things. So for example, it doesn't feel relevant for the SteerCo to meet on October, whatever it is, 7th, and have the next EAG meeting on October 15th, and call that sort of a meaningful amount of time to plan those meetings. So what we want to do is have a shift in sort of where the planning sort of takes place. If the SteerCo meeting is in early November, they're looking out ahead December, January, and everybody on the group knows that that's happening. And then lastly, which was the call to action that D'Amico made at the start of the meeting, that this can only be true if when the steering committee happens, an equity forum planning committee happens, or an actual equity forum happens, that EAJ members are active participating members in there and in the one-on-one spaces that we host, because we use that time productively between meetings. And so really what we wanted to just do is lay that out in front of everyone. And if folks have questions or if folks have acknowledgements that have heard some of this already, we don't want to move forward with a plan that not everybody is okay with or mostly has enough opportunity to get questions in. But otherwise, we're looking for the EAG to say, is this a proposal that you all would green light moving forward? And then that means that we're starting to build a shared accountability on expectations of EAG members, sort of the purpose-driven conversations and purpose-driven spaces, and then the responsiveness, at least from the facilitation team, to make those things actually happen. So I will pause there, and if there are questions or acknowledgements, or if anyone wants to mention anything as it relates to, maybe folks that sit on these subcommittees and are maybe seeing this for the first time. And then I want to make sure that we can sort of get that green light, or if there's enough to get the green light. And I see C had a clarifying. Oh, I also heard someone unmute.
Oh, no, that was me to not acknowledge C's clarification question.
Okay. So C's clarification question. Thank you, Aaron. Under equity forum planning, it says planning, debrief, and EAG integration is pointing to equity forums rather than all EAG activities. Correct? Yes, it's talking about the relationship between the equity forums, not necessarily planning all the EAG activities, not debriefing all the EAG activities. And equity forums are a form of community engagement. They're a point of community engagement. And so we could see perhaps, and I'm not, again, these are all proposals, could see perhaps in which that group is actually a place that's really driving some of the planning, debriefing, integration of larger EAG community engagement. But no, not for all activities. I see Dennis's hand. The hope being that some of these things that are especially of motivation and interest to EAG, to your point, Dennis, we can sort of see them out further, and yeah, and folks can have a better handle on them. Chris, I see you saying, echoing Dennis' comment, do you want to add anything or speak? Be responsive to this group as a whole, but largely through this expanded purpose of these steering committees and these equity forum planning committees and any one of those other driving spaces, then those other members of the group themselves will say, hey, this actually should come up sooner, or this is something that the group needs to address now. And then, like I said, in fact, that did happen today. It happened with a shorter timeline. I will give some credit to PSE and sort of making those shifts, but we felt that the clean energy, or the group felt the clean energy conversations that happen, felt this conversation needs to happen, but being able to do that with more foresight than just month to month is part of this goal. Any other comments or questions? And if not, my question is, yeah, great, Marco. The group need to come to consensus or want to come to consensus about something. So, there might be something that it, like you said, like a decision. I think that the way to develop consensus as a group, this is a space that obviously this is at least the minimum space that everyone all comes together. And to your point is a little bit is like, what is the lead up and preparation around having folks be able to share their opinions, share their perspectives, so that the group can say, hey, we're coming to consensus on this thing. I think the thing to think about is, if it could be appropriate for the group to come to consensus on some of those themes that we were talking earlier, some of this like a framework, like a community priority framework that says these are the sort of values, these are the sort of places where we set sort of boundaries or draw lines and what we want to uphold as it relates to equity for us. And then it enables a structure to be true throughout the there's time for like reflection, but a structure to be true that the group feels this way. And so it's complicated, but it prioritizes affordability. What does affordability mean to this group? It means these things. When does something take precedent over another? When do we think it's important to not prioritize cost when we need to prioritize people? Whatever it may be, having some sort of framework might be a way for this group to develop consensus on some key points that then allow, and to the points we were talking about earlier, when we know that something's coming out ahead of time, PSC are prompted to think about some of those priority frameworks of the EAG, and it helps understand how we have dialogue, where we have dialogue, and then yeah, where just it can make sense to have some of that consensus up ahead of time and not solely in some of these moments like this, but it'll be a structure that might support you all when you're in a moment like this one.
I also just wanted to add to that, in some of our earlier committee meetings last week and I think the week before, we were talking about, when you are in the community and some of our EAG equity forum folks were talking about it earlier, when you are going out and you're following up with folks, like what is that message you're delivering, and making sure that everyone is on the same page and the communications that are going out from EAG members represent the consensus and the priorities that you have, especially if you're trying to be more present in community more often. And so I think that like those conversations go hand in hand.
Thanks, Ariam. Dennis, TJ, and then I saw something in the chat from Amy. I also want to acknowledge, and I don't know if folks can let us know around public comment, or if you see folks, Ariam, and can sort of monitor that. But yeah, thank you, Dennis. It's totally about the pacing and the timing, having information, and that's what I think we're getting a lot from this point, where we know where the group sort of stands, has that consensus, has that shared messaging, has those shared priorities. We can feel better informed, to Dennis's point, around what might be some of those topics we know the EAG should address. I think the answer simply is yes, though, around and my piece here is it feels like an appropriate place for the steer code to be the first space that's sort of seeing that, and then having members from this EAG participate on the steer code if they're motivated to want to be part of that.
Yeah, I guess I was referring more to outside of the steering committee, if there's anyone with a recommendation or topic.
Got it. I hear you. I still think the answer is yes.
And I think the follow-up there would be to submit those to the steering committee and like find a way using either like Google Groups or email or text or, hey, I really want to put this on the agenda. Can y'all talk about this? I'm not able to make it, but please follow up. There's a few more chats and a few more hands. Go ahead, Ishmael.
Thanks. I saw C. I acknowledge C's hand.
Would be.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So a couple of immediate reactions to that, and then I'll go through these chat comments. So yeah, so one of them, because there's, I want to distinguish something, and I'm again not trying to like overlook. You all are using the term, for example, like vote, and I think being able to know that there's something that you want to have and come to consensus on is relevant, and I think as much as we can know that out in advance, I'm hearing you all want that, need that. So I think that's part of this proposal structural shift, and we can make sure that's sort of like a point. To do so, EAG needs to agree, but to do so, PSC also needs to agree around being sort of as upfront and proactive with information as possible. The next side of that is then, to your point, C, and totally get that timing piece, EAG members need to participate in whatever forums are going to exist for some of that consensus building. And whether we acknowledge that it happens in a full EAG meeting, whether we acknowledge that it happens in a subcommittee meeting, whether we say there's a, I'm seeing the word sort of protocol or process of information flow, it's not always going to be, and I see that in the chat, it's not always going to be like a position, but I think is going to be productive, to Ariam's point, it might be consistency of language. It might be, hey, what do you know that's going on in community? It might be, how are we messaging about X, Y, or Z? And so I think that what I want to get the feedback from this group, and this has all been great, is just the observation has been that it feels like we're a little bit inefficient in having some of these things hit their stride. And if we, as an EAG and members, agree to some of these points, and we can document and say some of the points that think PSC would have to do, could we move forward with that being something that we try out and start to do, with the assumption that we're all going to sort of commit to that. So I see your hand, Dennis, but I'm going to read a couple things in the chat, and then I'm acknowledge we're close on time, and I want to just make sure, like, do we feel like we've had the conversation we need to be able to move forward, or do we need to, go back and do any kind of resetting? Chris said, engage, educate, activate the roles we play to engaging the topics, giving the educational insight, playing an active role in the activation plans to move the issue forward. I think that's a good way to talk about the group's role. Elizabeth said, is there a process for submitting topics to the steering committee, or a way that we can know the potential topics for the steering committee? Right now, there is no specific process. It's not really the steering committee doesn't exist in that role right now. They don't exist in the role of driving on some of the agenda topics. And so we want to do a shift where there would need to be some sort of process for members to say, and for steering committee to also be working with EAG members to say, hey, here's what's coming up. Here's where we can fit this. Here's where we wouldn't. And Amy said, just to bring a sub comment to a comment, maybe part of the protocol is that we, as the PSC EAG, give more information to community than we ask for community comments. Not always a position, but bringing our questions to the public of our meeting. Exactly. It's like that's a great way to frame that. It's not necessarily always a position, but it's this, regardless, whether if it's education, whether it's engagement, whether it's some sort of consensus, helping to, inform you all. Just having a structure that allows EAG members to feel more in the driver's seat about those things. Okay, we're gonna go to Dennis's hand, and then I want to see if folks can give me some sense of temperature check. Is this mostly a thumbs up? Do we feel like we need to talk about this more? I see Kira's thumbs up, but yeah, go ahead, Dennis. Their perspective and seeing where the group falls, and not necessarily that it's going to fall in a singular place. So yes, the discussion is more important than coming to consensus. Okay, how do folks, so with that in mind, we've had sort of discussion here. I'm not going to take this necessarily as a position, but we'll call it a temperature check. How do folks feel about trying some of these structural shifts, or do we feel like there still needs some teasing out to no from you, Dennis? And so I think, oh, you're saying no. Maybe you, there you go. Okay, I got you. No is okay too. So what I think would like to do is I think is sort of take this as y'all giving us the grace to try and move forward with some of these structural shifts. Our role as sort of the facilitation team and sort of the third party is to push sort of this purpose-driven mechanism in a way that PSC staff are doing what they need to be doing, and EAG members are doing what they need to be doing. Our role is to support everyone's participation in that so that we can sort of actually live this out. So that is how I take the sort of thumbs up here today. And I see, Marco, your point around voting. And so, yeah, I think that's also one of those pieces that we can, when is it important to vote? When is it important to have discussion? When is it important to have consensus? Okay. We haven't had waiting room for public comment. We are at time. I'm gonna stop sharing. At the beginning of the meeting, I showed you an agenda. We focused on all the things that we wanted to elevate as priorities for this meeting. We wanted to give space to equity forum, planning debrief. We wanted to give space to the clean energy target conversation. We wanted to give space to these all in this meeting. We have a couple of topics to that point, specifically that distributional equity analysis on the net energy metering. We will postpone that to another conversation another day. We had Michael from PSC here. Thanks for your patience, Michael. I'm glad that we got to focus on what we did. So we'll begin to move forward with that, and hopefully that can lead to a little bit more streamline, a little bit more clarity around folks and their participation. With that, we'll close today's meeting. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in November. Bye, everyone. Thank you.